Hey horror fan! I create dark, spine-chilling horror stories, and you can help keep the horror alive. Imagine it's like buying me a hauntingly delicious cup of coffee to fuel the next gruesome tale. If you'd like to support, you can donate. My PayPal link is in the description. And with YouTube's guidelines, creating R-rated content is tricky, so if you're up for more unfiltered scares, come join me on Patreon. Thanks for helping me keep the nightmares coming. It all began on a stormy night in October when a package arrived at my doorstep. The rain lashed against the window panes, and thunder rolled ominously in the distance. I had recently moved to this small town, seeking solace from a chaotic past, but the unease in the air was palpable. The box was unmarked, but the moment I touched it, a chill ran down my spine. Inside was a doll, crudely crafted from dark, worn fabric, its features grotesque and unsettling. I couldn't tell whether it was meant to be a representation of someone or something else entirely. A small note accompanied it, written in an unfamiliar scrawl: "Handle with care, it knows what you fear." The sensation of dread enveloped me as I set the doll aside, dismissing it as some sick joke. Yet, a whisper of curiosity nagged at me, urging me to inspect it further. I placed it on my shelf, a morbid decoration amidst the other trinkets I had collected over the years. The days passed, and strange occurrences began to unfold. The air felt thick with an unseen tension, shadows danced longer than they should, and the doll seemed to shift positions, though I convinced myself it was my imagination. One night, I awoke to find the doll sitting on my chest, its glassy eyes staring into my soul. "Just a nightmare," I muttered, tossing it back onto the shelf. But the following day, a friend, Jenna, came over. She was a skeptic, always dismissing anything remotely supernatural. When she saw the doll, her face paled. "Get rid of it," she warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's bad news." I've heard stories about voodoo dolls, dark magic. I laughed it off, but her fear was infectious. That night, I decided to research the doll's origins, scouring the internet for anything related to black magic and voodoo. I stumbled upon a chilling account of a woman who had suffered greatly after acquiring a similar doll, one that had been used to inflict pain upon us. Pushed the stories aside as mere superstition. After all, I had lived through my own nightmares. Nothing could be worse than the memories I carried. But soon, the supernatural became too real to ignore. It began with whispers, soft, unintelligible voices calling to me in the dark. They filled the silence of my lonely nights, growing louder as I tossed and turned, struggling to find peace. Then, the nightmares escalated, showing me the faces of those I had lost, their eyes filled with accusation and fear. One evening, while preparing dinner, I cut my finger on a knife. The blood trickled down my hand, pooling on the countertop. I hadn't thought much of it until I glanced at the doll. It felt alive, almost as if it had absorbed the essence of my fear, my pain. In that moment, I realized I was trapped in a game I didn't understand. Determined to rid myself of the doll's grasp, I sought the help of a local woman named Madame Laveau, known for her knowledge of the occult. Her shop was cluttered with jars filled with strange substances and trinkets from countless cultures. "You must be careful," she warned, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Voodoo dolls are not to be taken lightly. They can bind you to the spirit world, and once they do, they don't let go easily." I handed her the doll, my heart racing. As she examined it, a look of horror crossed her face. "This is cursed," she murmured. "A powerful entity is tied to it. You must perform a cleansing ritual, or you risk losing your very soul." The ritual took place on a moonless night, surrounded by flickering candles and the smell of burning sage. Madame Laveau chanted incantations, her voice resonating with an ancient power. I felt the air grow thick with energy, crackling like static electricity. As she worked, I could see shadows moving in the corners of the room, dancing in time with the chants. I closed my eyes, allowing the rhythm to wash over me, hoping to break the connection that a deafening silence fell, and the candles flickered out. Madame Laveau collapsed to the ground, her eyes wide with terror. "It's too late," she gasped. The doll has awakened something dark. That night, the whispers returned, now louder and more insistent. They promised power, vengeance, and the ability to right the wrongs I had endured. I fought against the allure, but the pain of my past was suffocating, and the temptation was too great. Days turned into weeks, and I began to lose touch with reality. Friends started to vanish, one by one, their faces appearing in my nightmares, pleading for help. It was as if the doll fed on my fear, growing stronger as I spiraled deeper into despair. I could feel its grip tightening, the darkness clawing at my sanity. In a moment of weakness, I sought out the doll again, desperate for guidance, or perhaps companionship in my torment. One fateful night, I sat before the doll, a flickering candle illuminating its grotesque features. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, desperation leaking into my voice. The air thickened, and a voice, not my own, filled my mind. "Embrace the darkness, and I will grant you your desires." I felt an overwhelming rush of power, and in a moment of madness, I accepted the pact. I was willing to sacrifice everything to escape the torment of my past. In that instant, I lost a piece of my humanity, trading it for the promise of vengeance. The next morning, I awoke to find the doll in my bed, its eyes gleaming with a sinister glow. I could feel its power coursing through me, igniting a dark fire within. I began to see visions of my enemies, the people who had wronged me, their faces twisted in fear. The first victim was Jenna. I watched as she struggled, trapped in a web of her own fears, the doll's magic tightening around her like a noose. Her screams echoed in my mind, a twisted I felt exhilarated and horrified, torn between the intoxicating rush of power and the remnants of my conscience. As the days turned into a blur of torment and darkness, I realized the cost of my pact. The more I used the doll, the more I lost myself. Friends and family began to distance themselves, leaving me alone with the malevolent presence that had taken root within me. I was drawn deeper into a world of shadows, where reality blurred with nightmares. I couldn't tell if I was the puppeteer or the puppet anymore. The whispers grew louder, feeding off my every fear, demanding more sacrifices. It all came to a head one stormy night. I was drawn back to Madame Laveau's shop, the doll in hand. A vessel of my darkness. She confronted me, her eyes filled with a mix of pity and horror. "You have become a vessel for something far more powerful than you can comprehend," she warned. "You must sever the connection or risk losing everything." But I was beyond reason, consumed by the power coursing through me. In a moment of blind fury, I unleashed the full force of the doll's magic, seeking to destroy everything that had ever hurt me. The chaos that ensued was unimaginable. The walls of the shop trembled, shadows writhing as they broke free, claiming their victims. I could hear the cries of the damned, the pain echoing in my mind as I spiraled into madness. The doll laughed, a sinister, echoing sound that reverberated in the depths of my soul. I was losing myself, becoming nothing more than a puppet in a game far beyond my understanding. In that moment of realization, I knew I had to make a choice. I could either embrace the darkness fully or fight to reclaim the fragments of my shattered self. With the remnants of my will, I summoned the strength to confront the darkness that had claimed me. I reached for the doll, holding it tightly in my hands, focusing on the love and hope I once had. "Release me!" I screamed, pouring every ounce of my being into the command. The air crackled, and the shadows recoiled as I fought against the bond that had tied me to the doll. A blinding light enveloped me, illuminating the shop, and I felt the grip of the doll loosen. With one final effort, I hurled the doll into the abyss of shadows, severing the connection and reclaiming my life. As the dust settled, I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The oppressive weight that had consumed me lifted, and I could finally think clearly. Madame Laveau was gone, a victim of the chaos I had unleashed, and the shop lay in ruins. I emerged into the cold night, the storm having passed. I was free, but at a terrible cost. The memories of my journey lingered, and I knew that darkness would always be a part of me. Months passed, and I moved away, seeking to escape the shadows of my past. But as I settled into a new life, I received another package. My heart raced as I opened it to find a new doll, eerily similar to the first. The note simply read, "You can't escape what you've invited in." I felt the darkness stir within me, whispering promises of power and vengeance. The battle was far from over. I was still entangled in the doll's grasp, and in that moment, I understood, I would never truly be free. This chilling tale weaves together elements of suspense, horror, and the supernatural, engaging the audience with a gripping narrative. The reader is drawn into a world where the line between reality and the unknown blurs. Exploring the consequences of darkness and the human psyche's fragility in the face of evil, as I stared down at the doll lying in the box, that familiar chill crept up my spine, more intense than ever. Every instinct screamed at me to throw it away, burn it, do whatever it took to rid myself of its presence. But even as I thought it, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The doll was no ordinary object. It was a gateway, a portal to something ancient. It had seeped into my life once, and it wasn't finished with me yet. Days passed, and I tried my best to ignore the doll. I buried it in a locked drawer in the basement, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind. Yet, every night, I dreamed of it. In my dreams, the doll whispered, calling me by name in a language I didn't recognize but understood on a primal level. The dreams grew more vivid, more visceral, each one pulling me deeper into a nightmarish world of twisted shadows and endless corridors. I was running, always running, but something was chasing me, something that wore my own face but grinned with malicious intent. And when I finally stumbled and fell, the doll was there. Its dark eyes gleaming, reaching for me with arms that stretched out like serpents, coiling around me until I could no longer breathe. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in cold sweat, the taste of fear bitter on my tongue. But no matter how terrified I felt, some inexplicable force kept me from destroying the doll. It was as if it had woven itself into my thoughts, my very existence. It wasn't long before people around me started noticing the change. Friends and family, already scarce, drifted even further. My best friend, Sarah, confronted me one afternoon, worry etched into her face. "You look haunted," she whispered, glancing around as if something might hear us. I tried to laugh it off. But even to my own ears, the sound was hollow. "I'm just tired, that's all," I muttered, averting my eyes. But Sarah wasn't convinced. "Please, just talk to me. Whatever's going on, you don't have to face it alone." But I knew the truth. No one could help me. Not with this. I was in too deep, and the darkness wasn't going to let me go that easily. I felt a pang of regret as I watched her walk away, her face a mixture of hurt and fear. She could sense the darkness in me, just like I found myself completely isolated, as if the doll was systematically cutting me off from anyone who might care. It wanted me alone, vulnerable, and it was succeeding. One night, as I was sifting through the remnants of my old life, I came across a tattered book I didn't remember owning. The cover was worn, its title obscured, but as I flipped through the pages, an ominous feeling washed over me. The book was filled with symbols, spells, and rituals, all related to voodoo and black magic, and then I saw it, the very doll I'd received, sketched in intricate detail on a page labeled the Soulbinder. According to the book, the Soulbinder was no ordinary voodoo doll. It was a cursed object created to enslave its owner's soul. Binding it to a dark entity that thrived on fear and despair, there was only one way to break the connection, a cleansing ritual, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It required blood, my blood, and something far worse, a piece of my very essence. The idea filled me with dread, but it was the only chance I had. That night, as the clock struck midnight, I began preparing for the ritual. I set up candles in a circle, each one representing a part of my spirit, my hope, my memories, my love, and my courage. In the center, I placed the doll, its dark eyes glinting with a sinister intelligence. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence fell over the room as I cut my palm, letting the blood drip onto the doll. I whispered the incantation from the book, my voice trembling, each word resonating with an ancient power that I could feel echoing through my bones. As I chanted, shadows began to writhe around me, moving with a life of their own. I could feel the presence of something other in the room, something vast and malevolent. It was watching, waiting, and then, I felt it, a sharp, agonizing pull, as if something was being torn from within me. I clutched my chest, gasping as memories flashed before my eyes, my childhood, moment, people I loved. Each memory faded, slipping from my grasp as the darkness fed on them. The doll seemed to pulse with life, its stitched mouth curling into a twisted smile. I realized, too late, that the ritual wasn't breaking the connection, it was strengthening it. With a final, desperate scream, I threw the doll across the room, breaking the circle of candles. The shadows retreated, but the damage was done. I was weaker, drained, my spirit shattered, but the worst was yet to come. That night, the entity behind the doll revealed itself. It stood at the foot of my bed, a figure cloaked in darkness, its eyes blazing with a cruel, mocking light. It spoke in a voice that sounded like 1,000 tortured souls screaming in unison. "You are mine now," it hissed, reaching out with hands that dripped with shadows, clawing their way into my mind. I felt myself slipping away, drowning in its malevolent gaze, powerless to resist. As days passed, I became a hollow shell, my thoughts consumed by the entity's voice, which filled my mind with hatred and despair. It whispered dark secrets, urging me to commit unspeakable acts. It thrived on my suffering, my isolation, and each day, I felt my humanity slipping further away. I knew there was only one way to end this, to end me. The entity would lose its hold if I ceased to exist. But it was cunning, always a step ahead, twisting my every thought, convincing me that escape was impossible. And then, one night, as I stood at the edge of a bridge, staring down into the cold, dark water below, a strange calm washed over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope, a small spark that refused to die. With that hope as my guide, I decided to face the entity one final time. I returned home, prepared to confront the darkness, determined not to let it claim me. In the dead of night, I sat before the doll, staring into its unblinking eyes. I could feel the entity's presence, hovering just beyond the "I am not yours," I whispered, clutching a silver pendant that had belonged to my mother. It was a symbol of love, of hope, and it was the only thing I had left to hold on to. The entity laughed, a cold, hollow sound that resonated through the room. "You think that can save you? You are already mine." But I closed my eyes, focusing on the pendant, on the memories it held, on the love it represented. Slowly, I felt a warmth spread through me, a light pushing back against the darkness. The entity screamed, its form wavering as the light grew stronger, engulfing the room. With a final, desperate cry, I threw the doll into the fire, watching as it writhed and twisted, consumed by flames. The entity's screams filled the air, a cacophony of rage and despair, until it finally fell silent. In the days that followed, the darkness lifted. The doll was gone, and with it, the entity that had haunted me. The memories I had lost were gone forever, but I had regained my freedom. I knew that I would never be the same, that the scars of my ordeal would linger. But I had survived, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear faint whispers, echoes of the darkness that had once consumed me. But I am stronger now, and I will not let it take hold again. After burning the doll, life should have returned to normal. The air in my home felt lighter. My sleep deeper, the nightmares fading like mist under the morning sun. But the scars of that encounter ran deep, leaving shadows that never quite vanished. Days turned to weeks, and I resumed my daily routines, convincing myself that the doll's curse had ended. Yet, strange things began happening. Objects in my house would move ever so slightly. The kitchen light flickered at odd hours, and a chill crept into rooms that should have been warm. These disturbances were subtle but enough to unsettle me, keeping me on edge as if barely audible at first, like a murmur on the edge of sleep, then louder, more insistent. The whispers sounded like my own voice, but twisted, echoing memories from the ordeal with the doll. They reminded me of things I wished to forget, of the dark promises the entity had made to bind me forever. I would wake up in the dead of night to these voices, my heart pounding, my throat dry. But one night, the whispers grew louder, merging into a single, clear voice, a familiar, mocking tone that sent a cold shiver through my spine. "Did you really think you could get rid of me? It taunted, each word dripping with malice. I froze, feeling the weight of its presence pressing down on me. The entity was back, more insidious than before, lurking just beneath the surface of reality, watching, waiting. I knew it was bound to me still, a shadow I could never fully escape. Terrified but determined, I decided to find out more. I scoured every source I could find on cursed objects and soul-binding rituals. I visited old libraries, questioned paranormal experts, and delved into the darkest corners of occult lore. But every road led me to the same conclusion. Once a spirit had claimed a piece of you, it was nearly impossible to break free. One day, I stumbled upon an old legend about the Akasha shackle, a binding spell supposedly so powerful it could trap a soul eternally. According to the legend, it could be broken only if the shackle's source was destroyed, a relic of the entity's own origin, something that linked it to our world. This relic, however, could be anywhere. Finding it would be like searching for a needle in an endless void, yet I'd awaken to see the doll's faint image burned into my vision, its twisted smile taunting me from the darkness. One night, as I pored over ancient texts, the whispers grew louder, filling the room until they seemed to pulse within my skull. I clasped my hands over my ears, desperate to shut them out, but they only grew louder, merging into a single scream that rattled my bones. Suddenly, everything went silent. I looked around, heart racing, and there, in the darkest corner of the room, a figure began to materialize. It was the entity, a figure cloaked in darkness with glowing, hollow eyes and a smile that stretched too wide. I could feel its rage, a primal force radiating from it. Binding me in place, you think you can hide from me? It hissed, its voice slithering into my mind like venom. Paralyzed, I could only watch as it drifted closer, each step like a heartbeat, resonating with an oppressive weight. I tried to close my eyes, to block out the vision, but I felt its grip tightening around me. I knew what I had to do. If I was to break free, I needed something to sever the bond. In desperation, I returned to the ritual book, searching for a last resort. Deep within its pages, I found a spell, a dangerous, forbidden ritual that involved making a blood offering, a part of my own soul, to lure the entity into a final confrontation. But it came at a terrible price. I would lose part of myself forever. The instructions were clear. Under a blood-red moon, I needed to perform the ritual in a place where the boundary between worlds was thin. I found an old, abandoned church, its walls cracked and covered in vines, a place forgotten by time. It seemed fitting, almost poetic. I gathered everything I needed and went to the church that night. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the world itself was watching. I set up candles in a circle, just as the ritual demanded, and began. My voice trembled, but I forced myself to continue, drawing a blade across my palm, letting the blood drip onto the ground as an offering. The darkness around me deepened, swirling with an unnatural energy, and then the entity appeared, looming above me, its face a mask of pure malice. You think you can bind me? It sneered, but I could see fear flickering in its eyes. I pressed forward, chanting louder, summoning every ounce of my will. The entity screamed, writhing as the blood sealed it in place, but I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a piece of my soul being torn away, just as the ritual warned. The entity grew weaker, its form flickering, its voice trembling with desperation. It clawed at me, grasping for any piece of life it could hold on to, but I stood firm, pouring my essence into the spell, forcing it back. In a final, desperate move, the entity lunged at me, its shadowy form wrapping around me, suffocating. I could feel it trying to merge with me, its thoughts mingling with mine, filling my mind with images of endless torment. But then, in the midst of the darkness, I remembered the pendant, the one token of hope I still held. I gripped it tightly, focusing on its warmth, its light, the one piece of me that the entity could never touch. With a final scream, I poured every bit of my remaining strength into the pendant, unleashing a blinding light that engulfed the room. The entity's form shattered, dissipating into nothingness, leaving only silence. In the end, I was free, but not without cost. I'd lost a part of myself in the battle, a part that could never be recovered. I felt emptier, quieter, like a piece of me had died that night. The shadows still lingered in the corners of my mind, and I knew they would always be there, a reminder of the darkness I'd faced, but I was alive, and that was enough. For now, at least. Months later, I found myself at peace, though the scars of the ordeal would never fully fade. I knew that darkness returned to something that almost felt like normalcy. I tried to move forward, clinging to small routines and familiar comforts, convinced that the horror I'd endured was truly behind me. But the scars, invisible yet ever present, wouldn't let me forget. The shadows in my home still felt deeper, the silence heavier. When I glanced into mirrors, I would sometimes catch a flash of something in my reflection, a twist in my expression, a shadow in my eyes. Each time, I told myself it was my imagination, remnants of trauma lingering in my mind. Yet there was a persistent, gnawing feeling I couldn't shake, that I was being watched. One evening, as I sat alone, the room dark except for the soft glow of a single lamp. A chill washed over me, a familiar, invasive cold. I felt that presence, the suffocating weight I'd come to know so well. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind, but distinct enough to send a shiver down my spine. Did you really think you could escape? My breath caught, my heart pounding. I forced myself to stand, to move toward the door, but my legs felt heavy, as if weighed down by an unseen force. The whisper grew louder, clearer, echoing in the empty rooms. You invited me in. And now, I am part of you. I froze, realizing the horrifying truth. In my desperate attempt to banish the entity, I had somehow bound it to myself even more deeply. It wasn't gone. It was inside me, lurking in the recesses of my mind, watching, waiting. Days passed in a blur. I began to lose track of time, slipping between reality and surreal dreams that felt all too real. In these dreams, I would find myself standing in an endless void, surrounded by darkness so thick it was tangible. I'd hear the whispers, feel the entity's cold touch, and wake drenched in sweat, my heart racing. But then, the dreams began to spill over into waking life. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, whispers echoed down and felt its presence constantly, lurking just out of sight. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and I found myself spiraling, unable to tell where the haunting ended and my own mind began. My friends noticed the change in me. They'd ask if I was okay, offer words of comfort, but their faces looked distorted, twisted, as though the entity was taunting me by warping my perception of reality. I started isolating myself, locking doors and shutting out the world, convinced that everyone else was part of the nightmare. I could feel the entity's grip tightening, as though it was feeding off my despair, growing stronger with every day that passed. And in my moments of weakness, I began to hear it whispering promises, dark and tempting. Give in, it would say, and the pain will end. One night, as I sat alone in the darkness, my mind unraveling, I felt its presence coalesce, more powerful and undeniable than ever. The air grew thick, oppressive, and I knew it was there, watching, waiting for me to break. Why fight? It whispered, its voice a seductive purr that filled the room. You could be free, if only you'd accept me. Let me in, and I'll take away the pain. I shook my head, trying to push the voice away, but it grew louder, insistent. I could feel it reaching into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts, weaving itself into my memories. I was losing myself, slipping into the entity's grasp, and the fear of complete surrender made my blood run cold. But then I remembered something, a fragment from the ritual book, something about binding spirits to protect oneself. It was a dangerous spell, meant only for the most desperate cases, but I was beyond desperate. I knew I would rather risk everything than let the entity take me completely. In the dead of night, with trembling hands, I gathered what I needed and prepared for the ritual. The room filled with flickering candlelight casting eerie shapes on the walls as I chanted words of binding, my voice wavering but determined. The air grew colder, thicker, and I felt the entity's rage, its presence bearing down on me, but I pushed forward, pouring every ounce of my will into the ritual. For a moment, the shadows seemed to solidify, coalescing into a figure, a shape that resembled my own, twisted and dark, with eyes that gleamed with malice. It lunged toward me, but I held my ground, forcing the last words of the incantation from my lips. The entity shrieked, a sound so filled with hatred and anguish that it pierced my mind, sending waves of pain through my body. But then, in an instant, it was gone. The room fell silent, and I collapsed to the floor, exhausted, but free. The binding had worked, but I knew it wasn't a true victory. The entity was bound to me now, woven into the fabric of my mind, a part of me forever. I could feel it lurking in the recesses of my thoughts, silent but present, a shadow that would never leave. Life moved on, but I was changed. The world seemed darker, and I knew I would never be the same. At night, in the quiet moments before sleep, I could still hear it, faint and distant, whispering from the depths of my mind. One day, you'll let me out, it would say, a soft, haunting promise that lingered in the silent. I began to believe that I'd finally freed myself. The dark presence seemed quieter, as though the binding ritual had worked more thoroughly than I'd hoped. The shadowed corners of my home felt less oppressive, and the nightmares started to fade. Yet, there were small signs that something remained, whispers that would creep into my mind when I was alone, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, the sensation of being watched. I began to notice subtle changes in my reflection, shadows moving over my face, my expression twisting ever so slightly when I wasn't paying attention. It was as if the entity had found a way to linger, just on the edge of my consciousness. Embedded in the depths of my psyche. I told myself it was paranoia, a lingering effect of the horror I'd gone through, and tried to ignore it. But ignoring it only seemed to strengthen its grip. Then, one night, I woke to find myself standing in front of the mirror in the hallway. I had no memory of how I'd gotten there, and the reflection staring back at me wasn't mine. Its eyes were darker, its smile crooked and mocking, its expression twisted with a familiar malevolence. I backed away, heart pounding, but the reflection didn't move. In a low, raspy voice that felt like a knife scraping against bone, it whispered, "You thought you could bind me. But I am a part of you now." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet, and when I looked again, the reflection was gone. I was left staring at my own face, pale and terrified, the hallway shrouded in shadows. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, my mind racing with thoughts of possession, of losing myself completely to the darkness I had unwittingly let in. Days passed in a blur, and I began to feel myself slipping, as though the entity was slowly chipping away at my mind. I'd lose track of time, finding myself in rooms I didn't remember, recollection of what I'd been doing. My friends started to worry, their concerned expressions becoming a constant reminder of the isolation that was taking hold of me. But how could I explain to them the horror lurking within me? How could they possibly understand that I was fighting a battle against something I couldn't see, couldn't touch, yet felt all around me? Then came the dreams. They were vivid, oppressive, filled with twisted images and shadows that crept across the walls like living creatures. In these dreams, I was trapped in a labyrinth of mirrors, each one reflecting not just my face, but the face of the entity, twisted and mocking, its eyes gleaming with a darkness that threatened to consume me. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the entity's whispers echoing in my mind. One night, the dreams took a darker turn. I found myself in an old, decrepit house, the air thick with the scent of decay. Shadows moved in the corners, and the walls seemed to pulse, as though they were alive. I could feel the entity's presence, stronger than ever, its malevolent energy filling the air. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move, rooted to the floor by an unseen force. Then, I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows, its form shifting and twisting, eyes gleaming with a darkness that seemed to seep into my very soul. It moved closer, and as it did, I realized with a sickening horror that it was wearing my face. Its smile was a twisted mockery of my own, its eyes filled with a hatred that burned like fire. "You can't escape me," it whispered, its voice a rasping hiss that echoed through the empty house. "I am a part of you. Forever." I woke with a scream, my heart pounding, the entity's words lingering in my mind like a dark promise. I knew then that it wasn't going to let me go, that it was embedded in me, waiting for the moment when I would finally give in to its desperation. Drove me to seek answers, to find some way to rid myself of the entity's grip. I delved into books on black magic, ancient rituals, anything that might offer a solution. I knew I was playing with fire, that the very knowledge I was seeking could draw me deeper into the darkness, but I had no choice. The entity was consuming me, and if I didn't find a way to stop it, I knew it would eventually take over completely. One evening, I came across a ritual, ancient and dangerous, said to sever the bond between a human and a possessing spirit. The instructions were clear, but the warnings even clearer. It was a ritual of sacrifice, one that demanded something precious in exchange for freedom. The words echoed in my mind, filling me with a sense of dread, but I knew I had no other choice. The night of the ritual, I gathered the items I needed, a mirror, a blade, and a small vial of my own blood. I sat in a circle of salt, the mirror positioned in front of me, and began to chant the words, my voice shaking but determined. The air grew thick, oppressive, and I could feel the entity's anger, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. As I finished the chant, I looked into the mirror, and there it was, its face twisted with rage, its eyes burning with a hatred that sent a chill down my spine. I raised the blade, holding it over the mirror, ready to make the final cut that would sever our bond. You think you can escape me? It snarled, its voice a venomous hiss. You are mine. With a surge of defiance, I brought the blade down, shattering the mirror into 1,000 pieces. The entity screamed, a sound filled with pure, unadulterated rage, and for a moment, the room was filled with darkness, an overwhelming sense of despair that threatened to swallow me whole. But then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The room was silent, the air clear, and I felt a sense of peace, a lightness that I hadn't felt in months. I had finally freed myself from the entity's grasp. It's been 2 weeks since the ritual. At first, I thought I'd finally escaped. The oppressive weight that had hung over me for months had lifted, and I began to reclaim a sense of normalcy. But beneath that relief, a nagging doubt lingered, like a splinter in my mind. I'd spent too long in darkness to believe in a simple victory, and soon, the signs returned. At first, they were small, almost inconspicuous, a flickering light, objects slightly out of place, the faintest whisper in an empty room. It was enough to unnerve me, but not to convince me that the entity was still there. I told myself it was paranoia, the mind playing tricks after months of terror. But the incidents grew bolder, more obvious. The whispers grew louder, turning into mocking laughter that echoed through my home. Then, one night, I heard it. The sound of scratching, gentle at first, like a faint tapping, coming from the inside of my bedroom walls. I lay frozen in bed, my breath catching in my throat, as the noise grew louder, more insistent, until it felt as though something was clawing its way out, trying to escape into the room. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was just my imagination, that it would go away if I ignored it. But the scratching continued, relentless, each scrape against the wall a reminder that I had failed. I tried to look away, but my eyes were glued to the twisted version of myself staring back at me, its eyes dark, empty, and yet full of a malevolent intelligence. Then it spoke, its voice a raspy, mocking whisper that sounded like nails scraping over bone. You thought you could banish me? Fool. I am a part of you. Forever. I staggered back, but my reflection didn't move. It continued to stare, its smile growing wider, its eyes gleaming with a darkness that seemed to seep into the very room around me. I stumbled, knocking over a lamp in my haste to get away, and the crash shattered the silence, breaking the spell. When I looked back at the mirror, my own terrified face stared back. Pale and drawn, eyes wide with fear, the entity was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, a reminder that I was never truly alone. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel it watching, waiting for the moment I would let my guard down. The nightmares returned with a vengeance, darker and more twisted than before. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the entity's voice echoing in my mind, a constant reminder that it was still there, just beyond the veil of reality. the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my mind with thoughts that weren't my own. I began to doubt my own sanity, to question whether I was truly in control, or if the entity was slowly, insidiously taking over, chipping away at my mind until there was nothing left but darkness. One night, as I lay awake, the room bathed in shadows, I heard it again, the scratching. It was closer this time, as though it was coming from within the walls, just inches away. The sound was maddening, each scrape against the wall a reminder that the entity was trapped, imprisoned within the boundaries of my own mind, and that it was only a matter of time before it broke free. I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and began tearing for the source of the sound. But the closer I got, the louder it became, until it was deafening, a cacophony of scratching, scraping, and laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Finally, I reached the hallway, the sound of scratching louder than ever, and I turned, shining the flashlight on the mirror. And there it was, my own reflection, staring back at me with that twisted grin, its hand raised, fingers scratching against the glass from the inside. I dropped the flashlight, and the beam flickered, casting twisted shadows across the walls. My reflection's grin widened, its eyes gleaming with malevolent delight, and it whispered, "You can't escape me." The line between reality and nightmare began to blur. The entity was growing stronger, its presence more pervasive, seeping into every aspect of my life. I could feel it watching, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment I would finally break. My reflection became a constant tormentor, mocking me, taunting me with twisted expressions and silent laughter, a reminder that I was losing control, that the entity was winning. I began to see it in the corners of my vision, a shadow moving just beyond the edge of sight, a flicker of darkness that vanished whenever I turned to look. It was as though the entity had taken on a physical form, a shadowy figure that haunted my every step. A constant reminder that I was never truly alone. One evening, as I sat in my living room, trying to distract myself with the hum of the television, I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder, fingers pressing into my skin with an icy grip that sent a chill down my spine. I turned, but there was nothing there, only the empty room, bathed in the flickering light of the screen. But when I looked at the screen, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing behind me, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light, its mouth twisted into a smile that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. Heart racing, but the room was empty. I was losing my grip on reality, the lines between the living and the dead, the real and the supernatural, blurring until I could no longer tell where I ended and the entity began. The scratching became a nightly ritual, a dark lullaby that lulled me into a state of restless sleep. Each time I thought I could rest, it was there, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I began to dread the night, knowing that once the sun dipped below the horizon, the entity would return, clawing its way back into my life, reminding me of the pact I never intended to make. Desperation settled deep in my bones. I scoured every book on the occult I could find, searching for any hint, any glimmer of hope that might banish the entity for good. Every mention of black magic, every cursed doll, only served to remind me of my failures. I discovered stories of people who had tried to rid themselves of similar afflictions, only to find themselves pulled deeper into darkness. One night, I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by candles and the pages of half-read texts, trying to discern the meaning behind ancient symbols. The air was thick with the scent of wax and desperation, and as the candles flickered, shadows danced across the walls, mocking my futile attempts. A sudden noise broke the silence, a sharp crack that echoed through the room. My heart raced as I turned, expecting to see my reflection watching me from the mirror, but there was only darkness. I grabbed the nearest candle and held it high, the flickering light barely illuminating the corners of the room. Then I saw it, a figure in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the candlelight. It was tall and gaunt, with elongated limbs that seemed to bend and twist in unnatural ways. Its head was tilted, a grin splitting its face wide enough to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Panic surged through me as I scrambled backward, knocking over my candles, plunging the room into darkness. Days turned into a dread and darkness. I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but my mind was a battlefield, caught between reality and the horrific visions the entity forced upon me. Then, one evening, I noticed something chilling in my collection of dolls. One of them was missing. It was a small porcelain doll, dressed in a tattered white dress, the kind I had bought long before this nightmare began. I remembered placing it on the shelf, its blank stare seeming almost innocent, but now it was gone. I combed the house, frantically searching every nook and cranny, but it was nowhere to be found. The next morning, I found it lying face down in the corner of my bedroom, its hair matted. The once pristine dress now dirted and torn. I picked it up, shivering as I brushed my fingers over its cracked face. That's when I noticed something worse. The doll had changed. Its expression seemed to shift, the blank stare now replaced with a twisted grin that mirrored the entity's own. "What the hell are you doing?" I whispered to the doll, my voice trembling. As if in response, the temperature in the room dropped, and the shadows crept closer, swirling around me like a fog, whispering my name in a chorus of mocking laughter. The more I tried to escape, the more the entity seeped into my life. I began to notice other small changes, furniture slightly rearranged, the smell of something foul lingering in the air. The sensation of invisible hands brushing against my skin. At night, when I lay in bed, I could feel it, a cold breath on my neck, fingers trailing along my spine, whispering secrets of despair that only I could hear. One night, as I struggled to sleep, a loud crash echoed through the house. I bolted upright, heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. I stumbled out of bed, the beam of light shaking as I moved toward the source of the noise. The kitchen door swung ajar, the frame splintered, a wooden chair lying askew, my pulse racing. The shadows seemed to pulse around me, thickening and swirling as if alive. My eyes darted around, searching for the source of the chaos. Then I saw it, a dark figure standing in the corner, blending into the shadows. I froze, the air thickening around me as the entity's laughter echoed in my mind. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, the sound slithering into my ears, coiling around my thoughts like a snake ready to strike. "You're mine." I ran, crashing through the doorway and sprinting down the hall, heart racing. I burst into my bedroom and slammed the door shut, leaning against it, breathing heavily, trying to calm my racing heart. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it there with me, lurking just beyond the wood, waiting for the right moment to break through. Desperate, I turned to the mirror, its surface reflecting my fear-ridden face. I raised my hand, trembling, and touched the glass, expecting a cold chill to seep through. Instead, a jolt of energy surged through me, and I stumbled backward as a vision overtook my mind, a flicker of memories and not my own, moments of pain and suffering, each more horrific than the last. I was shown flashes of the entity's past, trapped within the cursed doll, its spirit filled with rage and despair, desperate to escape its confines. It clawed at the edges of my sanity, and in that moment, I understood. The ritual hadn't banished it, it had only fueled its anger, its desire for revenge. With this knowledge came clarity. I needed to confront it, to break the cycle once and for all. I dug out the remnants of the ritual I had performed weeks ago, the symbols etched into my memory, and prepared myself for another encounter. But this time, I wouldn't be naive, I wouldn't underestimate the darkness I was dealing with. I gathered the remaining dolls, placing them in a circle around me. Candles flickered ominously as I set the stage, breath, steadying myself as I recited the incantation once more, calling forth the spirit within the doll, demanding it show itself. The temperature dropped sharply, and the shadows in the room twisted and writhed, coalescing into the familiar form of the entity. It stood before me, eyes glowing with a malevolent light, a grin stretching across its face. "You think you can banish me again?" It hissed, the voice echoing with anger and despair. "You are nothing without me." With resolve hardening my heart, I stepped forward, facing the darkness head-on. "I know you now. You're nothing more than a coward hiding behind a doll, feeding on fear and despair. I will not let you control me." The entity roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of my home, and lunged toward me, but I was ready. I raised my hands, chanting the words of the spell with fierce determination, drawing upon every ounce of strength I had left. The candles flickered violently, the flames dancing as if in response to the energy crackling in the air. the entity writhed, its form shifting and morphing, trying to break free from the grip of the incantation. Shadows writhed around me, but I held my ground, pushing back against the darkness with everything I had. The dolls began to glow, a warm light emanating from within them, illuminating the room as the energy pulsed and surged. The entity screeched, its voice rising to a deafening crescendo, and in that moment, I saw it for what it truly was, a tormented spirit, lost and angry, trapped in a cycle of pain. With a final surge of power, I shouted the last words of the incantation, and the room erupted in blinding light. The shadows recoiled, and the entity screamed, a sound filled with agony and rage as it was pulled away, trapped once more within the dolls. As the light faded, I collapsed to the floor, the weight of what had just transpired settling by it, the oppressive presence gone, but the remnants of darkness still lingered in the corners of my mind. I knew I had won, for now, but the battle wasn't over. The scars of what I had experienced would remain, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. I gathered the dolls, placing them in a box and sealing it tight, vowing to never let them see the light of day again. The ordeal had changed me. I was no longer the naive person who had first encountered the doll. I had faced the darkness and survived, but I knew I could never let my guard down again. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a flicker of hope for the future. The nightmares had ceased. The whispers silenced. But deep within, I knew the truth. Darkness is patient. It waits for weakness, for moments of vulnerability to creep back in. And though I had triumphed, I would always be wary, forever vigilant against the shadows that might come to reclaim me. In the weeks that followed, I clung to the hope that my ordeal was finally over. The oppressive weight that had once filled every corner of my home seemed to have lifted, leaving behind a hollow silence. But even with the entity gone, there was a darkness that lingered, a residual chill that clung to the walls, the floors, and my very bones. It was like a stain that refused to be scrubbed away. I went about my daily life cautiously, as if any wrong move might shatter the fragile peace I had fought so hard to achieve. But at night, when shadows lengthened and the air grew thick, the silence felt unnatural, almost sinister. I found myself flinching at every creak, every sigh of the wind against my window, as though expecting something to crawl out of the shadows. Then, one night, just as I began to feel a semblance of normalcy, I noticed something out of place. The box where I had sealed the cursed dolls was sitting in the middle of my living room, its lid sounded as I approached it, the hairs on my neck standing on end. I knew I hadn't touched the box since sealing it, so how could it have moved? As I lifted the lid, dread washed over me. The dolls were still there, their eyes staring up at me, but something was different. Their faces, once frozen in blank expressions, now bore twisted, mocking smiles, as if laughing at my futile attempts to banish the entity. I backed away, heart racing, the sense of dread settling deep in my stomach. Had I truly defeated it, or had I merely given it another way to torment me? Days passed, each one more unsettling than the last. The house was quiet, but it was an unnatural quietness, a heavy silence that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. And then, one night, the whispering began again. At first, it was faint, a soft murmur that I could barely hear, like a voice calling from the end of a long tunnel. I told myself it was my imagination, a residual fear left over from the ordeal. But as the nights wore on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became a constant presence, filling my ears with a low, droning hum. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, the whispers took on a more sinister tone. They were no longer just sounds, they were words, twisted and hateful, aimed directly at me. You thought you could escape, the voice hissed, each word dripping with malice. But you belong to me. I sat up, my body drenched in cold sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls, filling the room with a sense of dread that was almost palpable. I clamped my hands over my ears, desperate to block it out, but the voice only grew louder, seeping into my mind like a poison. You will never be free, it taunted. I am part of you now. Desperation clawed at me, driving me to seek answers. I scoured my house, searching for any might explain its lingering presence. That's when I noticed the mirrors. They seemed normal at first glance, reflecting the room around me in dull, muted tones. But as I looked closer, I realized that something was off. My reflection didn't quite match my movements. It was a fraction of a second behind, a subtle delay that was barely noticeable but impossible to ignore, and then, in the corner of the mirror's reflection, I saw it. A figure stood just out of sight, a dark silhouette with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. It was watching me, its gaze piercing through the glass, and as I stared in horror, it raised a hand and waved. I stumbled back, heart pounding, the blood draining from my face. I knew without a doubt that the entity was still with me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The following days together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. I could feel the entity's influence seeping into my mind, its darkness tainting my thoughts, twisting my perception. I would catch glimpses of it out of the corner of my eye, a flash of movement, a shadow that shouldn't be there, and each time, my heart would race, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. I stopped sleeping, too afraid to close my eyes, knowing that the entity would be waiting in the darkness. My mind began to unravel, paranoia creeping in as I questioned my every thought, my every action. Was I still in control, or was the entity taking hold of my mind, slowly turning me into a puppet for its twisted desires? One night, as I sat in my living room, the box of dolls lying at my feet, I felt an overwhelming urge to destroy them. I grabbed one of the dolls, my hands shaking, and held it over the flame of a candle, watching as the fabric began to smolder. But as the fire took hold, a piercing scream filled the room, a sound so raw and filled with pain that it sent a shiver down my spine. I dropped the doll, watching in horror as the flames the doll untouched, its mocking grin still intact. The entity's laughter filled my ears, a cold, echoing sound that made my skin crawl. "You cannot destroy me," it whispered. "I am part of you." In the following days, I became consumed by the entity's presence. It was no longer just a haunting, it was an invasion, a constant reminder that I was never truly alone. Shadows moved on their own, whispers filled every corner of my home, and the line between reality and nightmare blurred. One night, as I lay in bed, the entity's presence stronger than ever, I felt a cold, clammy hand wrap around my wrist, pulling me into the darkness. My body went rigid, paralyzed with fear as the entity's face appeared before me. Its eyes filled with a hunger that sent a shiver down my spine. "Let me in," it whispered, its voice like a blade slicing through the silence. "Let me take what is mine." I fought against its pull, every fiber of my being screaming in protest as I struggled to break free. But the entity was relentless, its grip tightening, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "You cannot escape," it hissed. "You are mine." As the darkness closed in around me, I felt my mind begin to unravel, the boundaries between myself and the entity dissolving, until I was no longer sure where I ended and it began. The last thing I remember before succumbing to the darkness was the sound of my own voice. Echoing in the void, a desperate plea for release. When I awoke, I was no longer myself. The entity had taken hold, twisting my thoughts, my actions, until I was nothing more than a vessel for its darkness. I wandered through my home, my movements slow and deliberate, each step filled with a sense of dread and inevitability. As days bled into nights, my grip on reality weakened, and the entity's hold on my mind grew stronger. But even within the terror, a shred of defiance remained. I couldn't accept that this would be my fate, that I'd become nothing more than a puppet for a dark force beyond my control. One night, while desperately searching through old texts and online forums, I stumbled upon a passage about a ritual that could sever the bond between a human and a parasitic spirit. The ritual required a sacrifice, but it was vague on the details. Some part of me wondered if it was a trick, a ruse from the entity itself, but I was desperate. Armed with the instructions, I prepared. The items needed: a mirror, a flame, and something that held deep emotional value, were already in my possession. I set the mirror on the floor in front of me, the candle flickering beside it, casting eerie shadows across my face. The item of significance: a locket my mother had given me, a relic from a time before darkness took over my life. As I gazed into the mirror, I saw not my own face, but a twisted version of myself, the entity's sneering grin superimposed onto my own reflection. It felt as though it was daring me to proceed. I began the incantation, my voice trembling as I spoke each word with intent. The air grew heavy, thick with an energy I couldn't describe. The reflection in the mirror twisted, contorting as the entity screamed, a sound that reverberated through the room, echoing off the walls and searing into my soul. "Release me," I cried, my voice a mix of fear and desperation. "You don't belong here." But instead of retreating, the entity's hold only grew stronger. I could feel its presence burrowing deeper into my mind, merging with my thoughts, my memories, my very essence. The candle flickered wildly, casting shadows that danced across the walls like specters. Then, just as I felt myself slipping, a sudden wave of clarity washed over. This wasn't just about banishing the entity, it was about severing the emotional ties that bound me to it. The entity fed off my fear, my regret, my anger. If I could let go of these emotions, release the darkness within myself, I could weaken its hold. With a final scream, I threw the locket into the flame, watching as it melted away, symbolizing my release of the past. The entity shrieked, its reflection in the mirror distorting and fading as I let go of the emotions that had kept me chained to it. As dawn broke, the oppressive darkness that had filled my home seemed to lift, replaced by a peaceful silence. The air felt lighter, the shadows less menacing. I stared at the mirror. Now empty, reflecting nothing but my own weary face. The entity was gone, or so I thought. In the days that followed, I began to notice subtle changes within myself. I no longer felt the constant fear or dread that had once plagued me. My thoughts were clearer, my mind unburdened by the darkness that had once consumed me, but every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, a flicker of movement, a whisper of a voice. It was as if the entity had left a part of itself within me, a lingering reminder of the darkness I had faced, and in the depths of my soul, I knew that while I had banished the entity, its presence would always be with me. A shadow lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for the perfect moment to return. Years later, as I moved on with my life, I still couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was watching, waiting. It was a haunting presence, a reminder of the darkness that I had once allowed into my life. And though I had overcome it, I knew that it would always be a part of me, a ghost that would haunt me for the rest of my days. For in the end, true horror is not just about what lurks in the shadows, but what lingers within ourselves, the darkness we carry, the fears we can never fully escape.